Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. Citizens Committee for Children is one of New York's oldest and most respected advocacy groups, and it has come out with a report that should have gotten a lot more attention from our mainstream news outlets. There are 1.8 million children in New York, a population larger than the entire city of Philadelphia. An awful lot of those youngsters are not doing well. A third of all New York City kids are poor, and more than two-thirds are reading below grade level. Black and Latino children make up about 60% of New York's child population. Those two groups lag behind white and Asian youngsters in nearly every important category. The poverty rate for Latino children is approaching 40%. The high school graduation rates for Black and Latino children are low, and their classroom performance is often shockingly poor. In grades 3 through 8, only 18.1% of Black children and 18.3% of Latino children are reading at grade level. Are we going backwards? No. This data, as troubling as it is, believe it or not, represents an improvement over recent years. We'll talk about all of this with my guest, Jennifer March, the Executive Director of Citizens Committee for Children. Jennifer, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
First, let's say, tell us what Citizens Committee for Children is and what you see your mission as.
We're a 71-year-old child advocacy organization whose mission is to ensure that every child in New York City is healthy, housed, educated, and safe. And we spend the bulk of our time collecting data on children in New York City to paint a picture of how they're faring, and also evaluating public programs serving children to identify what's working, why it's working, and then create strategies to bring those things to scale.
So we've been hearing for a long time now, many years actually, about how well New York City is doing. And yet, I read your report, and we have an awful lot of kids in pretty serious trouble, including especially those poverty rates. And in addition to the families that are poor, you've got a lot of people who are low income and maybe not officially poor. So if the city is doing so well, why do we have so many families still mired in poverty?
I think it's a complex issue. I think what the data tells us is that there's been dramatic improvements over a variety of different things: infant mortality, child poverty declining slightly, high school graduation rates increasing, lower numbers of kids in foster care. But when we look behind the numbers, we see that race and ethnic disparities persist. And then when we look at the geographic level, we see that in certain communities, there are multiple risk factors impacting poor households. And that's really the challenge. It's not one thing we need to address, it's many.
So when you're looking at poverty, if you have youngsters growing up in families that are unstable economically, talk a little bit about the challenges those kids face.
Well, often it's not only a lack of income or low wages, it's also a housing situation that's unstable or housing in poor condition, a community environment that might have environmental factors that encourage higher rates of asthma, as well as school failure. So we really need to try to figure out how to tackle those issues in a way that ensures every community has the infrastructure of supports we know that help children thrive. And it's really fundamentally not that complicated when we talk about presenting solutions.
Right. So the committee has pointed out frequently, and again in this report, that it's not just poverty that's a problem, but it's concentrated poverty. Explain what concentrated poverty is and why that's so bad.
So concentrated poverty is really about it looking at entire communities and demonstrating that a child is impacted not only by the lack of income in a home, but by the prevalence or lack of resources in a community. When you're surrounded by a large number of people that lack resources and options, it has a detrimental impact on child well-being. And in those communities, you often see, unfortunately, unstable housing, greater homelessness, greater rates of health disparities. And so our efforts really are to paint a picture of how children are faring in New York City and begin to also measure what resources are present or absent in those communities and make a case for greater investments, targeted investments in those regions.
The 1 in 10 children in New York are living in, that seems an awfully high number to me, but 1 in 10 children are living in families that are below half of the official poverty line. So for a family of 4, I think that would be an income of about $12,000 a year. Now, I can't even imagine living in New York City on $12,000 a year. So can you talk a little bit about what the lives of those kids and their families are like?
Well, I think the level of stress in households that are that destitute is profound. So we often think about what really should be immediately available in programs that exist already to help alleviate that stress and ensure that those parents can either continue their education or maintain stable employment to improve resources coming into that household. So things like making sure children have access to school breakfast, lunch, and an afternoon snack that are federally subsidized programs in New York City, but we have a very poor take-up rate. Similarly, making sure that in those communities we have health clinics and mental health clinics in schools. So we're reaching children where they are and making sure that we're addressing the anxiety that they feel or the issues that they're struggling with managing at a young age because of household duress.
Are these the kinds of families that years ago would have been receiving welfare?
I think so, and at that level they are likely also receiving public assistance.
And but it's time limited now, and there are work requirements.
Yes.
I would also imagine there's illness is a problem, or disabilities, or
I think we are seeing that as the public assistance caseload has declined in New York City, those that remain on safety net assistance after their federal time limit has expired often do have health disparities and disabilities that make it harder for them to participate in the workforce.
Do we know what percentage of the population overall in New York City is poor by official standards?
I think it's 20%.
So, and then...
child poverty is 30.
And child poverty is 30. So beyond that, you have those families who are low income but are not down to the threshold of the official poverty rate. So it's a pretty large population that's struggling economically.
Right, and what we've seen is even though we're beginning to come out of the recession, the median income for blacks and Latinos is not rising at the rate of whites and Asians. And we've also seen that people continue to struggle with housing costs. There's over 30% of the population paying more than half their income towards rent. Well, when you're doing that, how do you then make sure that you're feeding, clothing your child, paying for transportation, and all the other things that you need to raise a child in New York City?
The report makes a big deal about the racial and ethnic disparities. So talk a little bit about that. What are some of the areas where we see the largest differences?
Well, I think what's particularly troubling is everyone knows that there's a housing crisis in New York City, and the numbers of homeless families is dramatic. We have 24,000 children living in homeless shelter in New York City. While black families represent only 25% of the population, they're well over 50% of the families in the homeless system. That's problematic. Similarly, while the city has done a very good job of reducing the infant mortality rate, cutting it in half over the last 2 decades, when you look at access to prenatal care for black mothers and the rates of infant mortality rates for black children are twice that, the citywide average. So we need to get behind that and determine, one, women should have health care coverage in the city. We're in a state that has almost universal coverage. And two, they should be accessing prenatal care.
Do we have a sense of you're right, it's a very complex issue, but do we have a sense of some of the causes of these problems that we're talking about? Is it a matter of government services primarily, or are there family issues, or is it most likely the problems with the economy, that there's not enough jobs, or what?
I think it's both. I do think poverty is really tied to education levels, and there's a really large population in New York City that lack even a high school education or GED. That makes it really difficult to participate in the economy and earn a living wage. We know, too, that the minimum wage has not increased, and it's by no means in New York City a living wage. And similarly, I think the challenge is with single-headed households, when you have only one income in a household in a city like New York, it makes it really, really challenging to make ends meet.
So you mentioned education, and I mean, it's true, education, if you're going to try and get out of poverty, education has become increasingly important in recent decades. But we've heard so much about education over the past couple of decades, it seems like, in New York now. Tremendous amounts of money have been spent. Enormous numbers of charter schools have been created, mayoral control of the schools, and yet we're still having these disparities. And most of these reforms were supposed to help the kids who are struggling most.
Right.
That doesn't seem to be happening. Why is that the case?
I actually think in New York City we're about to turn a corner. We do now have full-day universal pre-K for all 4-year-olds. Next fall we'll have 70,000 4-year-olds, reaching almost universality for all 4-year-olds. And we've begun to shift our focus and really look at how do we actually expand infant-toddler care, subsidized child care, particularly in poorer regions of the city. And I think if we build that continuum, birth to 5, we will really begin to see education outcomes turn around. We know that children begin to learn at birth. They don't begin to learn at 4. And so I think a combination of really heavy investments in infant-toddler care, making sure that mothers have adequate health care coverage, prenatal care, and targeted home visiting could begin to really turn the education outcomes in New York City around.
Now, you mentioned homelessness. So the Great Recession ended allegedly in 2009. Right. That's been a while ago. And yet we now have levels of homelessness in New York that I think have not been seen since the Great Depression, not the Great Recession. Something like 60,000 families actually seeking shelter in the shelter system every night, 25,000 of 60,000 people, I guess, seeking shelter. 25,000 of those people are children. What is going on with this explosion of homelessness at a time when we're supposed to be in an economic recovery?
I think what occurred when the bottom fell out of the economy, rents in New York City did not decline. So you take communities that were already struggling before the economic downturn with very little means, and increasing rents, and you create really a problem that's profoundly difficult to solve. I do think the city's focus on building affordable housing is the right one, as well as expanding rent subsidies for homeless families. But we really need to have all hands on deck in order to make sure we have adequate supply for the diverse range of people that live here in this city.
Now, when you have families in homeless shelters, and especially if they're there for an extended period of time, what are their lives like? What are the challenges they face?
Well, it's incredibly challenging because they're not only displaced from their home, but often their home community. So their entire support system, whether that's aunts, uncles, friends, the child's school, all of that is disrupted, which makes for a situation that's incredibly emotionally taxing. It's really problematic for children. We know that children that experience homelessness have much higher rates of mental illness, school disruption, school dropout. And so we need to really tackle that head on. I think the city is actually now beginning to make investments in social supports in homeless shelters, healthcare, mental health care, and those are good things.
Now, you mentioned housing several times, not just with homelessness. New York City, and this was pointed out in the report as well, is very much a city of renters. There are fewer homeowners percentage-wise in New York than in some other communities. So one, what are the reasons for that and what are the implications of that?
Well, I think it's really expensive to buy. I mean, you need really...
You can't afford it.
And very few people can afford to purchase in the 5 boroughs. I think as we begin to look at how the mayor proceeds with the affordable housing agenda that he has, we'd really like to also see how do we build supports in and around those communities, making sure there are parks and playgrounds as well as adequate school space and food retail that's affordable and convenient. So it's not only really finding a affordable place to live, but making sure communities are safe and have all the convenient resources that everyone needs, irrespective of income.
And homelessness is not limited to the folks who are in the shelters. I mean, there's a lot of people who are doubled up with relatives and friends and that sort of thing. For the kids in that scenario, do they face similar challenges to the kids in the shelters, or is there a difference?
I mean, I think it's important to have housing stability, but where there are greater numbers of people, there's greater stress in the household. Lack of privacy, overcrowding you can have more heated tempers. It's hard to live with multiple people.
Right.
So it really would be preferable to have families in their own apartments.
You mentioned to me that one of the goals of Citizens Committee is to break down what you described as the silos in government thinking and planning. Talk about that. What did you mean by that?
So often the city charges different city agencies to come up with really ambitious agendas. Affordable housing is one, or UPK is another. And it's our job as child advocates to think of kind of the collateral consequences of those initiatives and press the city to do more. So when they're advancing affordable housing plans, we say, okay, where are your parks and playgrounds in this agenda? In addition to transportation, can we think about food retail on the ground floor that's affordable and accessible? Or on universal pre-K, we think the expansion of full-day pre-K is incredible, but we want to begin, families often have more than one child. UPK is also in community-based settings, so what are we doing to make sure that the supports for young children, infants and toddlers, are there as well, so that we create a continuum. So we kind of just press them always to go farther. And then often to think about how to make use of things that often exist. So we know that children need to be educated in a school building, but there are appropriate spaces for health and mental health clinics, and we want to make sure that children are making use of school meals as well. So it's insufficient to just think of K-12 education.
Right.
While in school we press them to try to leverage other resources to make sure that kids have what they need in those environments.
Now, you mentioned health and mental health, and we've already spoken about some of the challenges faced by kids in the shelters, but what about in a broader sense for children in New York? Are we doing a reasonably good job in terms of getting health care, including mental health services to children?
Well, fortunately, well over 90% of all children in New York City have health insurance coverage. Unfortunately, on the mental health side, we've long had an inadequate supply of community-based mental health services, and children wait far too long for treatment once they're identified as needing an intervention. It could be 3 weeks to 3 months.
Right. And if a child is in trouble, that's a long time.
Yeah, waiting is inappropriate.
Yeah.
You want to intervene early and consistently.
Talk about these geographic differences that you found in the report. Is this just simply a case of, most of the problems are in poor neighborhoods, or is there something else going on when we look at the different boroughs and we look at the different neighborhoods?
Well, for the last 20 years, we've kind of mapped the concentration of risks in New York City, and we've seen really consistently that northern Manhattan, the South Bronx, North Central Brooklyn really struggle with cumulative risk factors that impact child well-being. And I think it's really a reflection of greater numbers of children residing in those areas, higher rates of poverty, lower levels of education for parents, more fragile connections to the workforce, and there's just a multiplier effect, unfortunately. But we actually do know what works to turn those things around. So my hope would be that the data book can be used to actually think about, okay, what is present in communities that people need to make greater use of, and when there are gaps in resources, how do we make sure that we're making those investments so that we build supports for those children?
One of the things that often gets overlooked when people are talking about child well-being is nutrition and access to adequate food and that sort of thing. What's the story there?
I think on some level, the city has made some progress. There are green carts now placed throughout different neighborhoods that lack supply. There's tax incentives to bring grocery stores into poorer communities, but we definitely need to do more. I think there are real serious challenges around convenience and affordability still in many communities where you could potentially have a small store that's providing an adequate array of nutritious foods, but it's expensive because it's small. So on some level, you need to both tackle the business side of food retail and make sure that the small business purveyor can actually make a profit, but do so in a way that allows him or her to offer convenient, affordable foods. It's very, very challenging.
I grew up in the suburbs where, you had these wonderful supermarkets, and you'd go in the car and you'd load up and food for the week or for 2 weeks or whatever. There's an awful lot of neighborhoods in New York where you certainly won't find a supermarket. You talked about some of these small stores. How do most families cope? I mean, how does a family do its normal food shopping in a distressed area in New York?
Right. Well, we've actually done interviews of households on just that very issue, and unfortunately some of the poorest households are paying for private car services or taking multiple buses to other neighborhoods to buy affordable foods, and then they have to really schlep them back to the community, which when you have multiple children and you might be working multiple jobs is very, very challenging.
So, and there's no easy answer to any of these issues, but there's really no easy answer to that one. So, but you've described yourself as the eternal optimist, we're specifically talking about problems on this show, but it's not all doom and gloom. But what are you particularly optimistic about?
I do think that the city administration is particularly focused on early education and after-school supports. I think if we actually build a strong system that's reaching the youngest children, elementary and high school children, in constructive activities before school and after school, that's a good thing. I think that their focus on mental health provides us a real opportunity to think about how do we actually ensure that we screen, assess, and intervene early in the life of children so that we prevent poor outcomes down the road. And I think that the approach to homelessness and affordable housing allows us to begin a conversation about really what are the infrastructure supports that should exist in every community that children and families should be able to conveniently take advantage of beyond transportation, parks, playgrounds, and food retail. So my hope is that this is just the beginning of a robust conversation to push really things that we know work for children forward in the city of New York.
To what extent is, we talk about the economic challenges facing families, but to what extent do budgetary matters in terms of city services or even state services play a role here? I mean, there seems to be such a vast landscape of need, and money is always tight.
Right. I mean, I do think that we need to effectively really engage the state and federal government in doing more for New York City and New York City's children in particular. I think that the city administration could set a really high bar on many of these issues, and there's a really groundswell of support in the advocacy and provider community to try to make these things happen. But in certain instances, like the school meals program, it's about leveraging the resources that already exist. I mean, only 45% of the population eligible is taking advantage of things that exist in schools today. That's inappropriate. We know that hungry children in the South Bronx could be benefiting from breakfast, lunch, and an afternoon snack, as well as summer meals programs. So we need to do everything in our power to make use of existing resources in that instance.
I guess I find it a little surprising that more people are not accessing things like the school food programs. In any event, we're running out of time. Thank you so much, Jennifer Marsh, for coming in. We'll be back in a moment with a final word. Khalif Browder, profiled in a New Yorker article last year, was yet another victim of our appalling criminal justice system. As a teenager accused of stealing a backpack, he was kept at Rikers Island for 3 years awaiting trial. 3 years. For nearly 2 of those years, he was kept in the hideous environment of solitary confinement, a form of torture that should have been relegated to the Middle Ages. He never recovered from that awful experience and ended up hanging himself in his parents' home in the Bronx. He was 22. That's how our justice system treated someone accused of stealing a backpack. I read about Khalif's death right after I'd read a separate piece about the family of Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old boy who was playing outside with a toy gun when he was shot to death by a Cleveland police officer. A videotape of the shooting showed that the officer shot Tamir just 2 seconds after arriving on the scene in a patrol car. We seem to hear about these outrages every day. Lives destroyed by a system of policing that shows little regard for human life. The innocent are slaughtered as easily as the guilty, the young as easily as the old. And seldom are the perpetrators of these awful injustices properly punished. Our entire criminal justice system needs to be thoroughly examined and overhauled from top to bottom, not just the police, but the prosecutors who collude with them, and the judicial system, the prison system, and every other facet of this defective enterprise. As it exists now, it is too often cruel, barbaric, racist, inhumane, and ineffective. That's all for now. See you next time.